Jason Statham entered the studio with the same calm as someone who has already won silent wars. What was supposed to be just an interview turned into a real confrontation, live, against the most arrogant presenter on TV. But what no one expected was what Jason would do next. Stay until the end because his answer will surprise you and leave the entire audience speechless. The studio lights gradually dimmed, immersing the space in a respectful, almost sacred silence. Conversations ceased as if someone had pressed an invisible button. A white spotlight cut through the shadows, illuminating the center of the stage where, seconds later, the firm and controlled steps of Jason Statham broke the suspense. He walked in no hurry, his shoulders square, expression unreadable, the aggressive elegance of a man who knew exactly who he was and where he was stepping. The dark blazer fell perfectly over his defined arms, and each movement seemed choreographed by years of discipline and silence. He wasn't there to entertain, he was there to confront. But no one knew that yet. The host, comfortably positioned in his leather armchair, watched with sharp eyes and a studied smile. He had already hosted politicians, singers, CEOs, and movie stars, and brought many of them down with well-chosen words. His game was simple: praise with a hint of disdain, provoke with the tone of a question. The audience loved the spectacle. He felt invincible in the arena he had created. Jason took his seat. He didn't say thank you, didn't wave. He simply sat down with the same firmness of someone preparing for something important. He slowly clasped his fingers in his lap, while the crowd still applauded, not understanding why the guests seemed so silent. The host broke the ice with a forced laugh. The typical opening monologue had been brief, almost mechanical. He was eager to start the attack. And when he looked Jason straight in the eye, he dropped his first question, crafted with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it 1,000 times in the mirror. Have you ever wondered if Hollywood only sees you as an action figure? Someone to punch, run, jump, but never really act? The audience let out nervous laughs. Some people looked around, seeking visual support to laugh more freely. Others remained silent, sensing the venom hidden beneath the seemingly light question. Jason didn't respond. Not a single muscle in his face moved, not even a slow blink, just a fixed, direct, sharp stare. The camera captured the moment perfectly, the interviewer smiling like a hunter, and the prey, still, inexplicably confident. The host continued, feeling comfortable in his role as the provocateur. He compared Jason with other actors, called him too safe, repetitive, predictable. He made sure to mention award-winning names, known for transforming themselves in every role. His words were blades wrapped in silk. Jason remained motionless, like a statue on the verge of exploding. It was like watching a storm slowly form over an open field. The audience noticed first. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. This wasn't an ordinary interview. There was something in Jason's silence that unsettled everyone. He wasn't hesitating. He was measuring, waiting for the right moment. The host realized it too late. The confidence of someone who controlled everything began to fade. His gestures became a bit quicker, his tone slightly higher. The questions grew shorter, but sharper. He was trying to force Jason to react. But Jason wasn't the kind to react impulsively. He chose the right moment to strike. The audience, once eager to laugh, now leaned forward, palms resting on knees, eyes wide open. Something big was about to happen. The camera moved slowly, focusing on Jason's eyes, his fingers on the chair's armrest, the slight tilt of his chin. Everything indicated tension, but not vulnerability. It indicated control. And then came the final provocation. The host paused and looked Jason in the eyes. He made sure to talk about his limited career, about how he never played deep characters, said Hollywood didn't place him alongside names like Daniel Day-Lewis or Christian Bale, maybe because they didn't see him as capable. The silence that followed was a clean cut through the air. Jason breathed in slightly. The light reflected off his tense jaw, and at that moment, with cameras fixed, the audience in complete silence, and the host smiling as if he believed he was winning, Everything started to change. He hadn't said a word, but everyone already knew the lion had awakened. The host still thought he was in control, but in less than 3 minutes he would discover he had just provoked the wrong man, live in front of millions. The studio, wrapped in tense silence, seemed to breathe with Jason. Time slowed. No sound escaped the audience, and even the spotlight seemed to hesitate, illuminating that endless pause with caution. On the other side of the table, the host adjusted his posture. His once relaxed shoulders were now slightly tense. The smile had faded, just a bit. He searched Jason's eyes for hesitation, for any sign of discomfort. But what he found was something else. Calculated coldness, restrained strength. The look of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. Jason slowly moved his fingers along the armrest. An almost imperceptible gesture, but one that said everything. He had heard, processed, evaluated, and now he was responding, without a single word. The host sensed he had gone too far, but the audience's instinct moved faster than his reasoning. A subtle stir revealed the shift. People who had laughed seconds ago now frowned. Some crossed their arms, uneasy. Others just watched, alert, as if they were witnessing something historic about to happen. Jason leaned forward slightly. His body spoke, not with aggression, with dominance. The host tried to break the tension with a joke, something light, ironic, sharp, like he was used to doing. But for the first time, the audience didn't respond as expected. 1 or 2 laughs died in the air. The rest remained silent. All eyes were on Jason, and only him. It was at that moment the balance truly shifted. The host had built his career exploiting human flaws. He was a specialist in provoking insecurities and turning interviews into disguised duels. But now, he was facing someone who wasn't shaken by insinuations, someone who didn't flinch under pressure. Jason didn't need to defend himself. His presence was enough. The invisible tension began to suffocate the host. He tugged at his jacket, licked his lips, shuffled through his cue cards as if desperately searching for a new angle. But nothing worked. The meticulously crafted plan was collapsing. And Jason hadn't said a word. His silence became uncomfortable, almost cruel. The kind of silence that forces the other to face their own mistakes. And the host felt it. Felt like he was being observed, studied, dismantled. Right there, in front of the cameras, in front of an audience that was beginning to change sides. Jason wasn't moving, but everyone could feel it. He wasn't holding back. He was building something. The host launched another attempt. He leaned on comparisons again, started naming actors considered true artists, men who transformed for their roles, while Jason repeated himself. He used words like complacency, lack of challenge, comfort zone. Tried to sell the idea that Jason was only physical without depth, but it wasn't a critique. It was a trap, and a poorly disguised one. Jason exhaled slowly through his nose. The audience noticed the movement. His breath was like the muffled roar of an animal about to rise. Still no words. But there was narrative. There was message. And then came the first real move. Jason turned his head toward the host with subtlety, just enough to look at him directly, without haste, without fear. His gaze carried a weight that no words could describe. The host felt it. Right there in front of the camera, the audience, the internet, he realized he was no longer in control. It didn't matter how many stage tricks he had. Jason had taken emotional control of the narrative, and not with shouts or attacks, but with presence, with truth. The audience was with him. The host tried to regain control through subtlety. He asked a biased question about Jason's background, suggesting that his career was the result of luck, not effort. It was the last resort, discrediting merit through chance. But it was a fatal mistake. Jason didn't respond with anger, nor irony. He simply leaned back, adjusted his posture, and let the light fall gently on his face. The camera captured the moment with brutal precision. His serene eyes, unshakable expression, his body in complete narrative control. The response came without words, but it was deafening. The audience understood, and the energy in the room exploded internally. Hands gripped chair arms, eyes locked together, respect emerging in every gesture. For the first time, it wasn't the host who led the spectacle. It was Jason. And all he did was exist in that space with truth. The host knew it. He had already lost. The interview was far from over, but the battle already had a winner. And the man who once sat in silence was now about to turn this stage into the most uncomfortable arena the host had ever stepped into. The host's chair creaked softly as he leaned back, trying to mask his discomfort beneath the facade of a new smile. But now, the smile wasn't the same. It was forced, almost begging for rescue. The cards up his sleeve had been played: comparisons, irony, devaluation, and none had worked. The audience, too quiet now, wasn't laughing, no longer aligned with the provocation. Jason Statham was still there, sitting, firm, unmoving like a rock that resists the wind. But in that moment, he decided to move forward, not by raising his voice, not by attacking, not with theatrics, just words, heavy as concrete, simple as truth. And then he spoke. His voice came out low, steady, carrying something beyond emotion. It was pure experience molded by pain, discipline, and fight. He wasn't responding just to the host. He was responding to years of judgment, to thousands of glances that labeled him with a single word: stereotype. And his response was a story. Not a story with a beginning, middle, and end, but a scene, a memory that spoke for itself. A slice of raw reality. He described in quiet detail what it meant to be thrown against a wall repeatedly. The pain that came after. The silence in the dressing room. The bones that cracked without making the tabloids. The sleepless nights. The marks on his skin. The blood that wouldn't come off with makeup. The solitude of doing that every day for years and still getting up at 5 a.m. with the same focus. The whole studio breathed with him. It wasn't just about stunts or acrobatics. It was about commitment, about living something for real so that the audience could believe it. While others transformed with wigs and accents, he transformed with bruises and fractures. And in that moment, it became clear. He wasn't defending himself, he was teaching. The host, on the other hand, shrank in his chair. His eyes searched the backstage, the monitors, the writers, as if someone could throw him an invisible lifeline. But there was nothing. He was alone now, alone with his own arrogance. Jason continued. He spoke about the people who went to the movies, those who struggled to afford a ticket, who left work sweaty and exhausted, and chose one of his films to forget, for 2 hours, that the world could be unfair. It was for those people that he kept doing what he did, because they felt it, they knew. When he took a punch, they felt it. When he fell and got back up, they rose too, without even realizing it. That's what he delivered. Not acting, but identification. The host tried to interrupt, a weak attempt to change the subject, but he was drowned out by the narrative power now dominating the studio. Jason didn't need to shout. He simply said what couldn't be ignored. And then came the breaking point. Jason locked eyes with the interviewer and, without looking away, posed a question. Not about career, not about fame, but about legacy. He asked in a measured voice, what would be left of it all when the cameras were turned off for good? When the spotlights went out? When the last applause faded? What would remain? The jokes? The awkward moments? The quick headlines? Or the respect? The question hung in the air like dense smoke. The host swallowed hard, but no answer came. Because deep down, he knew. The cameras kept rolling. But in that moment, it was as if everyone in the studio had stopped. The entire audience, the technical crew. Even the monitors seemed frozen. The only thing moving was the conscience of those who listened and felt every word. Jason was speaking to everyone. To the young people who'd been underestimated, to the forgotten workers, to those labeled as limited, to those who learned to live without applause. And every word was a stone in the castle of vanity the host had built. He had made his career tearing others down, exposing weaknesses. But now, his own weakness was impossible to hide: the absence of truth. Jason remained calm. He wasn't demanding apologies. He wasn't humiliating. He was simply showing the way, and making it clear that even without awards, even without applause, the world could be impacted by someone who simply refused to pretend. The audience was hypnotized. There were no tears, but there was something stronger: absolute respect. Jason hadn't won the debate. He had changed the game. He had turned the interview into a collective mirror. And now, everyone there, from the host to the viewers, saw their own reflection in a way they could no longer ignore. The host still had questions, cue cards in hand, rehearsed lines, ready jokes. But for the first time in his life, he no longer knew who the stage belonged to. Jason hadn't humiliated him, hadn't attacked. He had simply left him exposed. And what would come next was no longer an interview, it would be a mirror. The host took a deep breath and squared his shoulders like someone trying to regain a position of power that no longer existed. His hands were restless, fingers brushed over his question cards, but none seemed appropriate now. The studio, silent like an abandoned church, echoed the absence of control that once filled that space. He smiled, but the smile convinced no one, not even himself. He forced a new question, tried to change course, tried to soften, tried to seem human. But the tone came out wrong, forced, insecure, almost too ironic for the moment he was in. The question targeted Jason's past. It spoke of his origins, of his hard childhood, of how maybe he'd just been lucky to be noticed by the industry. It was a low blow, a desperate move, a way to minimize a journey he didn't understand, as if saying, "You're only here because the world made a mistake in giving you space." The audience reacted with discomfort. There was a whisper, a shifting of chairs, glances exchanged between strangers. People sensed this was too petty, too personal, too small. But Jason remained still. His eyes didn't blink. His breathing was calm. He didn't show anger, not even disappointment. He showed something else, a rare kind of strength that doesn't need words to assert itself. The strength of someone who has lived far beyond the limits of those judging him. And then he spoke. His voice filled the studio with a new weight. It wasn't a speech. It was revelation. He didn't tell a story. He dismantled a narrative. He spoke of how he grew up in forgotten neighborhoods of London, where there were no red carpets, only dirty ground. Where his first audience didn't applaud, they ignored. Where opportunities came disguised as struggle. Where being invisible was more common than being heard. He spoke of days selling fake perfumes on street corners, of learning to calculate every move, not to win, but just to survive. Of discovering, far too early, that the world gives you nothing, and everything worth having must be torn from your own flesh, not from others. With every sentence, the studio shrank. The host's chair seemed smaller. The previous applause felt distant. The cameras rolled, but now those watching no longer saw a talk show. They saw a reckoning with truth. Jason didn't speak with pride. He spoke with clarity. He made it clear that his origin wasn't an obstacle. It was the foundation, the living proof that no one needs Hollywood's permission to be respected. That value isn't in the role you play, but in the weight you carry, silently, every day. The host tried to smile again, but the audience didn't respond. Truth had changed the chemistry of the room, and Jason still had more to say. He began to describe what strength meant to him. It wasn't lifting weights or jumping off buildings. It was looking someone in the eye and saying, "You're not going to break me." It was hearing he wasn't good enough, and continuing. It was being ridiculed, diminished, dismissed, and still building something that inspires. It was being in a studio, questioned by someone who'd never been in his shoes, and not flinching. It was looking back and seeing each scar, physical, emotional, silent, as medals of resilience. Jason looked at the host, but not with hatred, with compassion, because he knew what the man across from him was trying to hide. Jason stood before someone who had never truly been hit, and therefore had never understood the value of someone who keeps getting up after falling. Silence returned, but now it was reverent. The audience understood, the host didn't, or maybe he did, and that's why he fell silent. He tried to mask the discomfort by fiddling with his mic, tried to recover, but it was too late. He was no longer the host. He was the guest who had been exposed without a single word spoken directly, and still Jason wasn't finished. There was one last layer to peel back, one final blow, not of anger but of revelation, the kind of truth that doesn't destroy, but reveals with brutal clarity who has always been pretending. Jason remained silent, and paradoxically he had never said so much. The host's chair now seemed tight. The armrests no longer supported tense elbows. His tailored suit began to betray a body sweating, not from heat, but from discomfort. For the first time in years, he realized something. He was no longer in control of his own narrative. The camera rotated slowly, and behind it, the eyes of the crew were no longer fixed on instructions, but on Jason. The script had collapsed. There was no more show, no more agenda. There was only that moment. Raw, irreversible. Jason took a deep breath. His voice didn't come out as an accusation. It came out as a mirror. Not for the interviewer. For everyone. He began to talk about a different kind of silence. The silence that comes when you're alone with your thoughts. Not the silence of studios, but of the mind. The kind that shows up when your head hits the pillow and the audience is no longer watching. In that silence, he said, "There's no makeup, no editing. There's only what you did, and what you avoided doing." And that's when he dropped the question no one expected. Not the audience, not the host, not the producers, not the millions who would later watch this moment. Jason asked, "What will you leave behind?" Not a fortune, not a file of episodes, but something that lasts longer than your name. The entire room froze. The host looked at Jason with the eyes of someone who, for the first time, didn't know what to say. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was a brutal invitation to introspection. Jason didn't stop. He described how his greatest concern was never to be remembered as an actor, but as a man, as a father, as a son, as someone who passed through the world and left behind something that couldn't be bought, sold, applauded, or deleted. He told without naming names about a fan, a child, with a degenerative disease, who watched his movies not for the action but because, in her words, he always gets back up. And that's when the truth emerged. Jason knew he wasn't the best actor in the world, and he didn't care, because he had something many others didn't: consistency. He was who he said he was, off camera, behind the scenes, in silence. And in that moment, the entire studio felt the impact of that word. Consistency. Rarer than talent, stronger than charisma, more valuable than fame. The host looked down. His fingers trembled slightly. It wasn't arrogance anymore. It was awareness. He was beginning to understand, not about Jason, but about himself. He began to realize that maybe he had spent all those years not as a communicator, but as a spectator of others' suffering, broadcasting it without ever feeling it, demanding truth without ever revealing his own. Jason remained calm. He didn't ask for apologies, he didn't gloat. He simply showed the path, and made it clear that even without awards, even without applause, the world could be moved by someone who simply refused to fake it. The audience was hypnotized. There were no tears, but there was something stronger: absolute respect. Jason hadn't won the debate. He had changed the game. He had turned the interview into a collective mirror, and now everyone there, from the host to the audience, saw their own reflection in a way they could no longer ignore. And then, at the peak of silence, Jason prepared the final question. One that didn't demand an immediate answer. One that would remain lodged in the ribs of everyone present and everyone who would watch later. Because what was coming next was no longer about him. It was about each of us. The studio was immersed in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable. It was reverent, the kind of silence that arrives when the truth has been spoken, and there's nothing left to add. Jason remained seated. His shoulders were relaxed, his gaze calm. There was no tension in his body, no defensive posture. He hadn't won anything. He wasn't there to win. He was there to show that sometimes what moves the world the most is what doesn't need to be shouted. On the other side, the host kept his eyes lowered. The fingers, once restless, now rested on the cards like someone who accepts that the script has lost its value. Everything he had prepared, each question, each provocation, each emotional trap, now lay on the table like shards of a broken emotional armor. Jason took a deep breath, and then, with the same calm he had entered with, leaned forward. There was no more monologue, no speech, just one last offering. He lifted his eyes and fixed them on the host, not as an accuser but as a revealer. And then he delivered the final question, not with harsh words but with a tone that pierced the soul. When all of this ends, who will you be without the cameras? It wasn't a provocation, it was a calling, an internal summons, a mirror that doesn't break, no matter which direction you look. The host, for the first time in years, was expressionless, not proud, not embarrassed, but impacted. His face revealed a man who had heard what he never expected to hear, something that didn't come from fame or the industry, but from the essence of someone who built their journey through falling and rising. The audience remained still. No one coughed, no one moved. Everyone knew that moment would be remembered for years. Jason didn't stand up immediately. He let the question linger in the air, as if to say without saying, "I'm leaving, but this question will stay." And then he rose. Without haste, without arrogance, without theatrics. The chair made a soft sound as it shifted backward. He adjusted his jacket, ran his hand along the hem of his shirt with the ease of someone finishing a mission, not a show. The audience, which until then had remained seated, began to rise, one person at a time. No one applauded yet. It wasn't time. It was a moment of pure respect. Jason stepped down from the stage, his eyes fixed on the exit, his steps firm, with the same silence he had used to dismantle an empire of superficiality. In the background, the host remained still. There was no closing speech, no final joke. He simply sat there, his eyes misty, unable to react. A man who, for years, had commanded a stage, and now faced the absence of his own legacy. The cameras were still rolling. Jason walked down the central aisle between rows of people watching him as if they were seeing someone cross an invisible line between entertainment and moral eternity. And then, without looking back, he removed his microphone, placed it on the sound table, adjusted his collar, and left. The door closed behind him with a sharp sound. Final. Transformative. Only then did the first clap echo, alone, from the back of the audience. Unhurried, unexaggerated, and like an emotional contagion, more hands joined. Slow claps, rhythmic, heavy with meaning. In seconds, the entire studio was on its feet, applauding a man who hadn't said what they wanted to hear, but what they needed to. At center stage, the host remained seated, his face exposed, his eyes lost. Complete silence. No words. No farewell. Nothing. He knew. This show would have no ending, because that moment wouldn't end there. The truth had been spoken, and like any good echo, it would keep resonating long after the lights went out. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect, don't let it go unnoticed. Like the video, comment below what you felt, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to the channel, Activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories, because here each video is made to truly move you.